Welcome to the tutorial about the deformation effect, the first video in the deformation video tutorial series. So in this tutorial, I'm going to go over what the deformation effect is, as well as explain to you the main deformation effects, as well as the secondary deformation effects. So before we begin, the first thing you need to do is bring up the deformation toolbar. You might see it by default in your interface, but if you don't, you just have to go to the top menu and select Windows, Toolbars, Deformation. For this tutorial, it's also handy to have the camera view toolbar, which is this toolbar right here. So the deformation effect acts as a skeleton that can be bent into fluid curves. It can be used with vector as well as bitmap graphics, texture fills like the one seen here, gradients, as well as text that has been converted into objects. It's similar to cutout animation and can be mixed and matched with that style. So the two main types of deformers are the bone deformers, which we can see an example of here, and a curve deformer, which we can see here on the elephant trunk. Within the network view, these two types of deformation chains are always within a group, so we can't see them, but they're the light blue groups above their drawing object. So this is L_arm, left arm, which is this object right here, and its deformation group, which happens to be bone, sits on top. And this elephant trunk right here has a deformation group just above as well, which happens to be a curve. So if we enter the first group by clicking on the small gray arrow here, I'm going to zoom out a bit so you can see the full chain. I don't know if you can see it because the print is quite small, but there's a bone module right here followed by an articulation module. So that's just a fancy way of saying a joint, so a place where a bend or a fold occurs. Then another bone, another articulation, and another bone. So this follows what we see here. Bone, joint, bone, joint, bone. So the bone module allows you to create a basic or advanced skeleton where the parent deformer controls the child deformer. So for example, if I grab this bone, it also rotates the other two bones attached to it. However, if I rotate the forearm bone, we see it only rotates the hand. So in this way, we know that the hand and the forearm are children of the upper arm, and that the hand is a child of the upper arm. So I'm just going to undo that. So this would mostly be used to animate the extremities or the appendages of a character, such as the arms and the legs, maybe a tail, for example, to give it more fluid looking movement. So you can also grab this handle right here, which is attached to what we call the deformation root, and you can use it to rotate the entire chain. You can grab any of the square blocks, so not the diamonds, but the square at the end of each bone to shorten or lengthen the part of the image that bone controls. So like that. So as you may have noticed, every bone is linked to a joint or an articulation. And you can also see that here in the network view. And as you'll see in a later tutorial, every time you create a bone, an articulation is automatically created for you so that you always have the structure bone, articulation, bone. So the curve chain, actually let's go back to the top so we can see our entire network, and this time go into the elephant trunk's deformation group, which is this one up here, by clicking on the gray arrow again. And let me back out. And you'll notice that it's quite different from the other one. There's a curve here, and that's it. There's no other articulations, and that's because I only have one curve in this chain. We haven't gone over it yet, but these three modules here and these three above the curve are exactly the same as 6 that you would see in a bone deformation chain. So the difference is that the curve deformer gives you complete flexibility. You can create fun zigzags and these types of sweeping curves in a way that you can't really do with the bone deformer. The original intention of the curve deformer was to animate elements that did not have joints. So for example, an elephant's trunk. However, don't let the original intention of these deformers limit your creativity in any way. If you want to have a character that has floppy arms like this, by all means use a curved deformer in the skeleton of an arm for your character. It's really up to you. So now let's talk about the secondary deformers. And to do this, we have to look at the module library. So let's bring it up by clicking on this down arrow and selecting Module Library. So in the Module Library, we have a tab just for all the deformation modules, and these tabs are listed in alphabetical order, so right before favorites, we have deformation. So in this tab, we have the bone and the curve, which we just saw as our main deformers, but we also have all these other deformers. So let's go through them all one by one. So let's go back to the top of the network view, and let's go back inside our left arm deformation group, because we've already seen a few articulations, but let's take a closer look by bringing up its layer properties. And you can do this in two ways. You can click on this little yellow square to bring up the layer properties of the articulation module, or what I'm actually going to do is open up a whole new window just for the layer properties, so that every time we click on a module, we'll be able to see its properties without having to click on this yellow box or without having to have a floating window appear. There we go. So as you can see, there are quite a few properties for the articulation, and the one that we're looking at presently is the first articulation right here. And you have to click on it to see the properties appear. Let's start at the beginning. You can rename your articulation if you like by entering that name in the field here. So if you want to be more precise, you could say a left elbow joint or something like that, so that you know exactly which one you're modifying as you're modifying it. The influence type is something we're going to devote an entire video to, but I'll go over it briefly. Each articulation and bone for that matter, and curve for that matter, all of those deformers have a region that influences the drawing that's associated around it in the camera view. Depending what that influence type is how this drawing, whether it's a bitmap or a vector drawing, is influenced or bends or moves or is warped, in other words. So the four types of influences are zero, infinite, elliptic, and shaped. So zero influence means that there's no influence at all from the articulation, bone, or curve deformer on the drawn object. Infinite means that the influence actually radiates up perpendicular to the bone, articulation, or curve all the way to infinity, both up and down, or to left and right, depending on the orientation of your bone, curve, or articulation. Elliptic actually gives a shape around these three deformers. And if I select it and then click on the Show All Zones of Influence button, you can now see that this is sort of a truncated ellipse because I haven't pulled it out to its full form, but you can see that there is in fact an ellipse type shape around the articulation, and that is now the zone of influence that'll influence this drawing behind the articulation. And the last one is shaped, which gives you a rectangular shape like this, and you're able to take the Bezier points and handles and form them to create a very precise shape around the articulation, bone, or curve. So I'm going to set this back to infinite. So the influence fade radius is the zone where the transition is made between the influence type and the background. So it works mostly for the ellipse and shaped choices, and we'll see that in more detail, but it's what makes the transition between this drawing object within the influence zone and any other drawing object on the same layer that's not part of the influence zone, and it's just that transition that's made. Symmetrical ellipse of influence is when you have the elliptic selected once again, and as you know, an ellipse has two radii. the radii that traverses the shortest part of the ellipse and the radius that traverses the longest part of the ellipse. So if you keep the symmetric ellipse of influence on, then if you make changes to the left transversal radius as well as the left longitudinal radius, what it'll do is it'll actually change the radius for both the right and the left side of the longest and the shortest part of the ellipse. If you uncheck this, you're then able to change the radius for both the transversal and longitudinal parts of the ellipse on the left and right side independently. So that's what that does. So we haven't gotten into the rest position yet. It's a concept I'm going to explain later, but you can choose the rest or resting radius, orientation, which means the rotation, and bias, which means how sharp the bend is, so whether it's a smooth arc or like a sharp peak. For this articulation, it also exists for the bone and the curve in this area. And then the radius, orientation, and bias without the word rest or resting is the active forms of these three parameters. And as you can see, there are functions that exist for all three, which means that you can animate these things over time. You can animate the orientation, you can animate the radius, as we'll see, which affects the curve often of the deformed shape, and the bias. So those are all the layer properties for the articulation. So now let's go back to the module library to take a look at the next secondary deformation effect, and that's the autofold. So what I'm going to do in the network view is go back to the top. And because the deformation effects use grouping so often, we've developed a keyboard shortcut to allow you to exit groups quite quickly, and that's a backspace on Windows and the delete button on Mac. So I'm going to use that to exit the group. So you might be wondering on Mac, well then how do you actually delete modules? And you're now able to do that using function delete. And if you'd like to change any of those keyboard shortcuts, of course you can in the preferences panel. So now let's look for our elephant trunk deformation group, which is the light blue one right here. And what I'm going to do is take the autofold and drag and drop it within that deformation group. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually hide the other two drawing objects, and I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here, and I'm going to try to create a type of fold so that you can see why we would need the autofold effect. Okay, actually it's best like this. So I'm going to zoom in so you can see. So sometimes when you fold, this occurs. Two lines end up crossing, and of course that's not what you want. You want there to be a clean break, or maybe a little bit of one of the two lines to indicate a fold, but you definitely don't want this double crossing of the line. So that's why the deformation autofold and just the regular fold modules exist. So let's try the autofold first. And we're going to do this by holding down the Alt key and dragging it across the chain. And you always place it under the place where you would like to fix the lines. So in this case, it's under the curve, but we only have one curve, so it's obvious. If there's a bone in articulation, it's actually under the articulation. Even if it's for a specific bone, you have to place it under the articulation for that bone. So as you can already see, part of the problem has been fixed, and it's easiest to see the modifications made using this effect in the render mode. And in fact, I'm just going to enable the color card as well because it's easier to see in white. So you can see it's not bad, but part of this blue is missing. So this is the reason you have to adjust some of the parameters here. And there are very few parameters for the auto fold. And we can fool around with this a little bit to see if anything changes if we increase or decrease the value by a bit. So you might have to increase it by a lot to see a dramatic change. So in cases like this, where it doesn't seem to be working as well as you would like for your specific fold, it's probably when it's a good time to use the actual fold, where there's a lot more parameters. The only other option that exists here is the enable auto fold. So obviously 1 is enabled and 0 is disabled. And you might wonder why this is, and that's because you can actually animate enabling and disabling over time, because at a certain frame you might not need the autofold to appear, so then you can disable it at a certain frame and then re-enable it at another frame, and that's why that function exists, and this on-off switch exists for the autofold. So I'm actually going to delete this by using function delete because I'm on a Mac. And let's go back to the module library, and this time I'm going to use the actual fold. So I'm skipping ahead here and bypassing all these other deformation effects, but I'd like to show you because these two sort of go hand in hand. So I'll hold down Alt and drag it across, and now you can see that there's a bunch of different parameters. So you have a lot more play this time with the folding. So of course you have the enable fold once again, so 1 being enabled, 0 being disabled. The rest of the properties are better described in the camera view by seeing the controls. So I'm going to click on the camera view and zoom out a bit. And to show the controls, on Windows you would use Shift F11. On Mac it's Command F11, like that. And what we need to do first is fix the orientation, which is the rotation. So this line that we see, we actually want here, bisecting these two intersecting lines. So we can do that by changing the rotation here in the layer properties panel, or we could do it directly in the camera view. And I go back to the OpenGL view by rotating it like this. But to actually get an accurate idea of where this should rotate to, we should actually change the where first, and that's to physically move the entire group closer to the fold. So you get something like this. Let's zoom in again. And once again, it's best to check it out in the render view mode. So it's not bad. We got rid of this line here, but now we're missing some of the blue right here. So this is when you have to play with the parameters to get exactly what you want. You also have these two blue handles, which, if we go back to the deformation fold, are the span before and the span after. So what they're really deciding is whether you're able to see these. So if you grab the white arrow, it's actually what moves the entire deformation fold control. So what we're looking for is the dark blue. And if you pull this back and forth, it makes the lines disappear or reappear. So this is the span after is this one, and the span before is the one over here. There we go. So it's just sort of far off. So this is what we're looking for here. And so we want to keep it here because we do want to keep this blue, but we still want to get rid of this little black line. So we probably have to keep either rotating a little bit or playing with the span before and after. And once again, all of these functions are animatable over time. And this is good if you have a character that moves a lot and moves its arms a lot and they're folding back and forth. You can play with these properties over time. I'm just going to press Shift M to reset, and we're going to go back to the OpenGL view. So the next thing we want to look at is the auto muscle. So it's perfect that we're back on this arm because that's where we'd like to see the auto muscle group. So let's go into that group and then drag and drop the auto muscle into that group. So just like the fold effect, we'd like to put the auto muscle under the bone where we'd like it to act upon, but not just under the bone, but under the last articulation, since it's always bone articulation bone. So we want the muscle to inflate right here, which means we would put the module after this articulation. So right here in this deformation chain. So I'm going to hold down Alt and drag it across. And actually I'm just going to hide the influence. So the auto muscle also has quite a few properties. You can rename your auto muscle to make it more specific to the exact part that it's acting on. If muscle left is chosen, then you're able to change the parameters for the muscle that will appear on top of this bone deformer. Left start is telling you where the inflation will start, and the numbering system goes as follows. So the auto muscle, wherever you place it in this chain, becomes 0 automatically. If you work up backwards, then every module above it is -1 number. So this articulation is -1, this bone is -2, etc. This bone is actually +1. So we want it to start at the start of this bone, which is -2, and that's where it's put by default. The left span is the length for which the muscle will act over, and it's put to 1 by default because that relates to the length of the bone that it's acting on. The left amplitude is how physically large the muscle will get. And actually, let me animate the muscle so you can actually see what I'm talking about. So right now it's not super big when you bring the arm in, so you can increase the amplitude to something much bigger, like 4, and you can see how much bigger it became automatically. So even just increasing it to 1 makes it that much bigger. So the right muscle is actually considered this part underneath. So it has all the same properties as the left muscle, which is what's considered on top. And if you grab the arm and pull it downwards, you'll see the right muscle inflate. So if you don't want the arm to do that, because it isn't really a natural movement, you just have to uncheck muscle right. However, if you check what's underneath it, same as left, along with muscle rights, they both have to be checked. Both the top and the bottom will inflate as you pump the arm inwards. And that might not be natural, once again, for a human arm, but there are other uses for an effect similar to that. Okay, so let's go back to our module library. And let's look at the next deformation module. So we've already looked at the bone, and we've already looked at the curve. And in fact, the layer properties for both the bone and the curve are very similar, if not identical, to what we saw for the articulation. So we're going to skip past those. And the next one we're going to look at is the deformation composite. And we have a deformation composite already in the network view in several groups. So here's the deformation composite. If we click on it, we can see its properties in the Layer Properties panel. But because they're so wide, what I'm going to do is click on this yellow square to have them appear as a floating window. So a deformation composite is very similar to a regular composite in that it assembles all the modules attached to it, composites them together, and then outputs them based on the adjustments made in its Layer Properties panel. So the first parameter that you can adjust is that you can change the name of the composite to be more specific to what's going on in this chain. The second option, output kinematic only, is always turned off by default so that this chain is outputted properly. If you would like to output only the position information of the chain, then you can check this box. A situation where you may want to just output the position information is when you start parenting one chain to another. If you are only outputting the position information, then you can connect it to a hierarchy without it being deformed by what's going on in that other chain. So the output selected port only works when there are several deformation chains for one element, such as with a character with multiple poses. So we don't see that right now, but later on we're going to see several groups that are attached to the deformation composite, each being a different skeleton for, say, the front, three-quarter profile, and side views of a character. So if you output the selected port only, you can decide which of these three skeletons make sense to output at a given time. And if you enable this option, you then have the option of selecting one of the choices from the output kinematic chain drop-down menu. So the rightmost obviously corresponds to the fact that if there are several ports, it'll take the rightmost port to output, leftmost being the leftmost port. If you choose select, then you can select which port you would like to output based on a numerical system. That being that the leftmost port will be considered number 1, and if say you have 8 different groups, then the rightmost would be number 8. And you can enter that information into this field below, output kinematic chain selection. So the next option, use first connected elements exposure as key, also has to do with having multiple groups connected to the deformation composite. And what it does is it takes a look at the first exposure of the group that is connected to its leftmost port and uses that information to decide which of these groups that it needs to output. And the last option, use parents composites connected element exposure, actually works with this first option of output kinematic only. And this works once again when you're parenting certain chains to other chains. So what the composite does is it uses the information from the parent's element exposure to attach the child to the correct chain following which pose is exposed. And once again, all this will become more clear and be reiterated when we actually rig a character with several different poses in a future tutorial. So I'm going to set that back to rightmost and actually unselect that and close layer properties. So the next module we'd like to look at from the Deformation tab is the Deformation root. And once again, this already exists in the network view. And if we scroll upwards, we're still in this ARM group. It's this right here, the Deformation root, and it's always between the multi-port in, so the port of the group and the offset. And what the root does, you may notice that I refer to this here at the elbow as an articulation, but I've never referred to what's going on at the shoulder as an articulation. So we have a bone, articulation, bone, but this is actually considered the root. And you can see that it's a little bit different than the other round circled articulations in that you have this handle, for example, that allows for a full rotation because it recognizes that it's the root. It's where this chain starts. So if we click on it in the network view, we can see its layer properties appear. And it only has really one, and that's the quality. And what this relates to is the quality of the bends that occur throughout the chain. You can't see it. I think even if I go super close, I'll try to show you. But if you change the quality to something like low and you have a bend like this, what this is doing is it's taking the millions of little slices that cut up the image to make this round bend possible. It actually fragments it more if it's at low quality because there are fewer slices. So at very high, you probably don't even see it. It's so smooth you won't even see those little slices because so many of them are being made. Okay, so if we go back to the module library again, the next module we'd like to take a look at is the deformation scale. So I'll drop that in here. And actually I'm going to delete the auto muscle by using function delete. So the deformation scale always has to be placed under the last deformer that you have in your group. So for us it's bone 2, and that's the bone that's right before the deformation composite. So I'm just going to bring it down here, hold down Alt, and pass it under. So what the deformation scale does is that you may have noticed that with the curves and the bones, they can scale like this. So they can scale lengthwise, parallel to the original deformer, so the bone, but they can't scale widthwise. So what the deformation scale does is it allows you to scale widthwise, so perpendicular to the deformer. So I'm going to click on the deformation scale so we can see its properties. And this looks kind of scary, but it's actually not so bad. Already we can see there's a left side and a right side that are identical, so that halves the properties. I'll only explain the first half here for the left side. The left side, once again, being this top part, the right part being the part underneath. And this is another effect that you need to see the controls for. So if you remember, you can use Shift F11 in Windows or Command F11 on a Mac. And let's zoom in to take a better look. And most of these things will be explained to you as I actually make movements in the camera view. So it might be the best way to explain it. So you might not be able to tell now, but if you pull on one of these dots, it's actually a Bezier handle. And what I just moved was the left start handle scale. So that's pretty obvious, and you might be able to guess that this one is the left end handle scale. And then if we go back to the camera view and we move the base of this Bezier handle, we can see that it's the left start scale, so this must be the left end scale, for example. And you can see that you can move this very intuitively, so you don't necessarily need to change the value in these fields. You can do it all in the camera view if you like. So these right here, these little handles, these are the left end handle position, and this is the left start handle position, and you see that they are kind of moving the handles as well as you move them back and forth. So it's sort of a different way of getting a different type of curve. This is more like up and down, and this seems to be more left to right. And of course these are the only values that are left over, which is the left start and the left span. So the span would be, once again, the length where this deformation will occur. So the other two here at the top are the left fade in and the left fade out. So let's change those values to see what they do. So what it does is it smooths out the transition between the start of the span and the part outside of that. And this is the fade in, so this over here would be the fade out. And I'm just going to experiment to see if it takes a negative value, which it does, and it seems to make quite a bump if you use a negative value in this case. So let's go back to something positive like that. And then if we scroll down, all of these are identical to what we saw up here, but they're using these light blue controllers because this is the right side of this deformer, otherwise known as the bone. So the only thing we really need to look at is that if you uncheck this, you don't have the option of performing any type of scaling on the right side, and that also exists and is also true for the left side. You can choose not to do anything to it. And then you also have same as left. So if you click on that, it'll just take all of the values that we put here on the left side and apply them to the right. And once again, all of these options can also be animated over time, and that's why they all have function columns at the end of all the fields. Okay, so the next deformation module we'd like to look at is the deformation switch. So once again, this already exists at the end of an average deformation group that's automatically created. So a deformation switch acts as an on-off switch for your deformation chain. It's as easy as that. And it seems like some of the parameters are being hidden here, so I'm just going to click on the yellow box again to make a floating window. So where you would put that 1 or 0, you can see it here, would be in the enable deformation field. But because we've already started animating a bit, you'd have to actually go into the function editor, and I could change this value to 0. And if we close this, you could see that now no deformation, I'm going to use Shift M to reset the view, has been made to this arm at all. So the scaling has been removed and all of the animation has been removed as well. So we're going to go back and change that value back to 1. And now everything has returned as it was before. So besides being an on-off switch, the deformation switch actually houses a few interesting properties. So the vector quality can also be controlled here, and that's what we saw before, where a bend is basically as good as its quality, and it's being cut up into a bunch of different slices or sections. So depending on whether you have low or high quality, it affects the smoothness of the curve of the bends or the deformation folds that are made. A lot of the influence zone fade out is also controlled here. So it's in combination with the actual deformer, so the actual articulation, bone, or curve deformers, layer properties, and this option right here, influence fade out exponent. So if you have an exponent of 1, it's a linear fade out. If you have a positive number, it's like an ease in fade out. And if you have a negative number, it's like an ease out. Once again, we're going to go into this in detail in another video. So fade inside zone we'll also talk about later, but basically the fade in occurs outside the zone. If you click this, then all of that kind of blending or trying to make a natural smoothness between the shape and its background can be done inside the zone. And lastly, the kinematic chain selection reference. So if you remember back to the deformation composite, you had the option of selecting a specific chain to be outputted. And once again, that's if you have multiple chains or multiple groups going into the composite. And the reason it's here as well as in the composite is that the composite does not appear in the timeline view. So if we uncollapse the deformation group for the left arm, and I'm just going to expand this, and we scroll down, you'll see the deformation scale, the deformation switch, the bones, the articulations, the offset, and the root, but you will not see the composite. So because you see the switch, and it has this kinematic chain reference, that means in the data view, if you expand the deformation switch, you can then animate the kinematic chain selection reference over time through the switch as it's referencing the composite. So that's the only reason that it's there. So the next deformation module we'd like to take a look at is the deformation uniform scale. So I'm going to drop that into our group. I'm going to delete the deformation scale that's already here by using function delete, and I'm going to move this one in its place by holding down Alt. So I guess it goes without saying that it has to be placed under the last deformer in your chain, which in this case happens to be above the deformation composite. And we also would like to see the controls. So let's use our Command F11 or Shift F11, depending if we're using Windows or Mac. And this one is much more simple, and also the number of properties is much more simple. So you can obviously change the scale in the layer properties panel. So obviously 11 is quite a large number. So let's just make that 2 to double the size here in the layer properties, or you can do it using this bar. I don't think I've mentioned it, but I should have earlier, that every time I'm making changes here, I'm always using the transform tool. And because I happen to have the animate mode on, I'm actually creating a keyframe here and it's being recorded. So you should be aware of that as you're doing this. And so you can see I can make an expansion like this, and you can get decimal values or partial values instead of those huge whole number jumps. So, you know, it's a nice way to inflate something uniformly throughout. So the next deformation module that I'd like to take a look at is a deformation wave. But this time I'm going to use it on the curve instead of the bone and articulations. It actually doesn't matter which you use it on, but I thought that it might look a little bit more natural on the elephant. So we're going to get rid of that and bring up the elephant curve. And we're going to go back to the top view, find our chain, go into our group, delete the deformation fold. Once again, you can stack different effects. It's just to make them clear, I'm only showing you one at a time. Otherwise it could get quite confusing as to what it actually does. And maybe I'll move him back to something a bit more normal. So something like that. Close the data view as well, just to clean things up a bit. And we're going to drop in the deformation wave. And I actually think we might need a few more curves. So I'm going to drop in 2 curves as well. So I'm going to attach an extra curve under the original as well as the second. And the deformation wave is always placed underneath the last deformer. So this would be the last curve we have. I'm just going to adjust the curves here before I start doing anything else. So you kind of have to ignore what I'm doing right now. I'll show you how to do it later. This is just to make the example a little more pertinent. There we go. Okay, so now let's apply our deformation wave underneath our last deformer by holding down Alt and passing it underneath. And right away you can see it taking effect. You can see what kind of wave deformation you can create by using this effect and animating it over time. But let's take a look at its layer properties. So once again, you have the option of having a left wave and a right wave. So the left, once again, is on top, the right is on the bottom, and checking these boxes enables or disables the left or the right wave. So the left start is where the wave will start on the left side, so on this top side here. And it considers the root 0, the second bone or articulation 2. So if there's an actual bone there, it would be 2. If there's an articulation, it would be 3. Because curves are attached curve to curve to curve with no articulation, it's really the first curve, the second curve, and the third curve. So it starts at 0, which is the first curve. And if we wanted it to start at the second curve, we could put 1 instead. And where this green box is, that's where the second curve starts. So obviously you saw now that there's no wave here, and our wave starts at this second box. And you could also do it for the second deformer. So it's really going from here to here to here as the start position. So I'll move that back to 0. So the left span defines the length of the deformation wave. However, it's more the left offset deformer that we're interested in here. If we hook this value up to a function, we can animate what looks like the wave undulating over time. So the left amplitude defines the height of each individual peak. So if we change the value to 2, it doubles the height, for example. The left offset scaling also increases or can decrease the height. However, it goes from the base, and it's not just the peaks. So I'll show you what I mean if I enter in a value of 2. So it's once again being lifted, but more from this base area. The left period defines how many bumps or peaks there are per deformer. So right now we have 3 curved deformers here, and that's why we have these 3 bumps. If we change it to 0.5, we actually get 2 bumps per period, so per curved deformer. And of course, this enables the wave right, and we can choose, same as left, to have that mirrored on the right side. Okay, so let's take a look at the last deformation module, because we've already taken a look at the fold, so all we have left is the offset. And in fact, we already have an offset in our chain here. It's the one second to the top underneath the deformation root. So an offset is always added in the chain, and what it does is it's what decides the position of the entire chain, both in the resting position and in the animated position. So this being the root. And that's why it's actually hooked directly underneath the root in the deformation chain. So once again, in its layer properties, if we take a look, you can rename the module to make it more precise to what's going on in your chain. Over here we have two sets of X and Y axes. So the first at the top is actually used for the resting position, and that's why they are not animatable over time. There's no function curve here. So once again, we haven't gotten into the resting position yet, but it's what you would do in setup mode, and it's the base position for your chain. So you can add values using the cardinal coordinates, so that's east-west for the x-axis and north-south for the y-axis to define negative or positive values. The resting orientation, of course, is the rotation from this point. And once again, you'll be doing that all in the setup mode. You can define, if you want, these functions below for the active positions as separate or 2D path. If you choose 2D path, then these are linked together as one path, the X and Y axes. However, if you choose separate, you're able to animate them separately over time, and that's the same for the orientation. So I believe I've covered all the modules in the Deformation tab. So just to reiterate, you basically learned about all the basic parts of a basic deformation chain, things like the articulation, curve, bone, offset, root, composite, deformation composite, for example, as well as a bunch of deformations that you can add afterwards, such as the wave, the fold, things like that, as added bonuses to your deformation chain. So that's it for the tutorial about the deformation effect. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, Deforming Basics.